What's up everyone, Steven here from techmaker.tv. In this episode, I want to take a look at the entity attribute value model. It's possible that you've actually been programming for quite a while and haven't heard of this. I hadn't heard of it. I had actually worked with it for a while unknowingly and then learned what it was called. And it's actually pretty handy, so I thought I would just go through it here and explain it and work through some examples. Reading about it can be perplexing, especially if you're not used to reading sort of mathematical sounding things, so I'll walk you through that. But anyway, before we jump in, as always, give this video a thumbs up. It helps me out a lot, and while you're here, go ahead and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. With that said, let's go ahead and take a look at this entity attribute value model, or EAV for short, because I'm definitely going to stumble over that if I keep having to say the whole thing. So let's just go with EAV. So according to Wikipedia, EAV is a data model to encode in a space-efficient manner entities where the number of attributes, properties, parameters that can be used to describe them is potentially vast, but the number that will actually apply to a given entity is relatively modest. Such entities correspond to the mathematical notion of a sparse matrix. So you got all of that and we're done here, right? No, just kidding. So I want to take a look at this in a few more examples, and then we're going to look at some realistic, not even realistic, maybe even kind of funny examples. We'll see what we come up with here in a minute, but yeah, we need to get a little bit better explanation than that. So the next thing I want to look at, I looked at this diagram here. I think this is a UML diagram. As you can tell, I'm not the most formal person when it comes to development, if you've watched many of my videos. But anyway, so we've essentially got three tables here. We have an entities table or model. We have an attributes table or model, and a values. And if you've done much with Rails or databases, you'll recognize this as basically some kind of join table or model. You have an attribute ID that points up here, so that's that foreign key, and entity ID which points up here. So this essentially connects the two, and then we have a value. The other thing, and this is actually kind of left off here, but in some cases you'll see like a type field over here on attributes. It's kind of weird that it's not here actually, but this is just a generic model. So anyway, this kind of gives you some structure. I don't love looking at things like this. If I make these sorts of things, I draw them with like circles and squiggly lines and stuff, so they look a little less like they came out of something from the 90s, and less intimidating for some reason. In any case, there's one thing I want to point out. I found this interesting article while researching the EAV. And this lines up exactly with my professional experience, and I had a line in here I wanted just to highlight, so you can obviously look up these links. I'll drop them down in the description. But the EAV was designed with the intent of getting data in with the trade-off of being difficult to get data back out. So you will see as we go through some actual code here in just a few minutes why this is. I just wanted to point this out. I'm not going to go through the solutions that they propose here, but I'll link down to this article in the description so you can go through and read that. So with that said, all of this, if we just stopped here, would not leave you knowing much more about anything most likely. So let's walk through some actual examples here. So I created a new little generic app that I think I'm going to use when I'm walking through just kind of random examples. So what I want to do just to start, so let's imagine that you're building some kind of CRM, and you're going to have a model in your CRM called something like customer, right? I think customer relationship management is the name of the game. So we're going to create a model, Rails G model customer, and let's give them a name, an email, and I don't know, job title, title, company name, and that's it. I don't want to get too much that I have to type out here in a minute. So let's take a look at what we just did. Let me go ahead and migrate this. We're going to have a look at this, and let's talk about what entities, attributes, and values are in the sense of like a normal database table. Because we work with this all the time, we just don't call it this. And the EAV is not, it is specifically not the thing that we typically deal with. But it's named after things and is meant to mimic things we typically deal with in some ways. So let's open up the Rails console here. And let's have a look at user. So no, it's not user. That's not what I called it. I called it customer. Just kidding. Okay, so we'll do a new customer. So we'll say customer.new customer equals underscore. We'll say customer.name equals Jennifer. Customer.email. Should have named that just like C or something for less typing. Email equals jen@acme.com. Customer.job title equals CEO. And customer.company name equals Acme. And we'll just save this customer here. Okay, so let's take a look at our customer. So if we say customer.asJSON, well, first of all, before we do that, let's just say customer.attributes. And so we're going to get here a list of attributes, which makes sense. And we can actually, I think we can do customer.columns. Is that it? Yeah, that's it. Can we do attributes here on the class? I don't know if we can do that. No, we can't. Okay. So anyway, that's not what I wanted to do. Getting myself sidetracked out of curiosity. So customer.attributes. So you can see here when we call attributes, we get ID, name, email, job title, so on and so forth. And this is actually a hash, and so we can call this and say .values, and we're going to get the actual values spit out to us in an array. So just in this brief explanation where we're talking about built-in naming inside of Rails, we're getting some similar naming from the entity attribute value model, right? So we have to look at this and say, okay, the customer is in this case the entity, and this entity has attributes, which, you know, we skipped over the fact that this is a hash, but we can kind of identify that these keys in this hash are in fact the attributes, and then the values are the actual values that fill out those attributes in the hash. So essentially, we've got our entity attribute value model right here in front of us. But as I said, this isn't the real EAV. This is just something that is named similarly in the actual terminology inside the code in Rails. And it happens to be something that the EAV tries to mimic, but, and this is really where the key is. So we need to go back over here to this Wikipedia article. So such entities correspond to the mathematical notion of a sparse matrix. So we're not going to go into what that is, but we're going to go through building out the model, but I want to show you the use case first and why you would want to do it. So when we're talking about a sparse matrix, we don't need to explain the mathematical concept here, but whenever you start adding fields to a model that are going to be null most of the time, and you start having multiple of those things, you might want to reach for an EAV. So let me show you what I'm saying. So suppose that, well, we're building the CRM. That's what we said, right? Well, sometimes you might want to know more information about a customer. And, you know, in a CRM system, you know, it depends on what kind of business you're running, but knowing any kind of information might be valuable, right? So here's an example. Suppose that you are trying to provide salespeople with interesting tidbits of information about the customers so that they can connect with them better, potentially increase their conversion rates or whatever it is, right? So you have an executive or somebody who says, okay, what I want to know, I want to add to our database the customer's favorite member of the Beatles, which is kind of a random thing, but we can do it, right? So we'll say Rails G migration, add favorite Beatle to customers, and we'll say Beatle, well, let's say favorite Beatle, and that'll just be a string. Okay, Rails DB migrate, and the feature is basically finished, right? Okay, now we come back, and the customer says again to us, and when I say customer, I mean like the manager or whoever it is that's giving us these feature requests. they say, okay, that was great. We're really happy with knowing who the favorite Beatle is. We want to do the same thing, and now we want to know what their favorite sports car was, or maybe what their first sports car was, or something like that. So we're like, okay, well, I guess we can do that again. Let's add first sports car to customer. So first sports car. And over here, we'll do the same thing. First sports car. And then we migrate the database and we're done with our feature. Now, obviously in a real app, this takes a lot more effort than just creating some attributes and migrating, but we're kind of just pretending here. Okay, so next thing, the customer comes back and says, you know what? I want to add another field. How many kids do they have? And you think to yourself, wait a minute, not everybody drives a sports car, not everybody has kids, and not everybody likes the Beatles. And also I'm getting really tired of having to add all these fields. So when we talk about the sparse matrix back over here in the browser, what we're talking about again is having like a column on your database table where most of the entries are blank, right? Or many of them, an abnormally large amount, maybe you could say. Like a first sports car is probably going to be pretty highly null. If you're dealing with young people, the number of kids is going to be pretty empty, potentially, depending on where you are in the world and so on. So what we want to do is find a way to, first of all, from just a less work for me perspective, it would be great if we could let the customer add their own attributes they want to care about. And I'm going to call this, well, I got to think about it for a second, but we want to let them add their own things that they want to track about the customer. While I'm thinking about that, before I do that, let's go ahead and roll this back twice. Rails DB roll back. And one more time here. Rails DB roll back. And then let me come in here and just go ahead and delete these migrations that I wrote here. So we'll just go ahead and get rid of those. And that one. So I think what I'm going to call this is a fact. So it's a fact about a customer. It's kind of basic, but I think it makes sense. So we're going to create this thing and we're going to say Rails G model fact. And it's going to need to have a title or a name. Let's give it a name. And let's give it a data type in this case. And maybe that's enough, actually. Let me think for just a second to be sure, but I think that's enough. Yeah, that's enough. Actually, I just thought of one thing right after I ran that and said it was enough. So I'm going to go ahead and just Rails D that thing. And let's just Rails G it again. And I want to do, I'm going to give it a key. And again, we're kind of faking an application here. So, you know, what happens in the real application if you're working on something like this may be a fair bit different. But this should set us up to do something interesting here. So let's just go ahead and run that. And let's go back over and look at that UML diagram we had pulled up earlier. So they have entities. So our entity is the customer. So you don't necessarily literally have to have something called entity. And our attributes are these facts. So the attributes we care about in this context are the facts. And so we don't literally have to call them attributes. I think I will call them values for this join table or join model just because I don't really know what else to call it. And I think it makes sense for the moment. Maybe we'll call it a fact value just to make it more clear. But let's go ahead and set that up. So what we'll do is do something like this. We'll say Rails G model and we'll call it a fact value. And I need to tell it that it references the customer. It references the fact. And it needs to store value. So you can store it in a field called value. I tend to use a field called data. So you have like It always bothers me for some reason when you have something like value.value. So I prefer like value.data. And I'm going to store this in text here. And let me just think if there's anything else that I need, because last time that didn't go so well. I think that's okay for now. Let's go check our UML here before we actually run the migrations and just see what they have. So they just have the ID, which is default in Rails in our case, and then they have the attribute, the entity, and the value. So I think we're good. So let's go ahead and run the migrations here. So Rails DB migrate. And back over here in our app, I broke something. What did I do? Undefined method customer for active record connection adapter. Did I get that backwards when I ran that? Let's see here. Let's look in the migration. References customer, foreign key true. Do I not have a model called customer? What's going on here? What is going on here? Let's just quickly look at that last command that I ran. I think I typed something wrong. Let's see here. What was it? Rails G model fact value customer reference. Oh, fact customer. Okay, yeah, that doesn't make any sense. So let's hit that with the Rails D and try again. All right, and then we'll Rails G, and then we'll say fact references. This is fun. Okay, here we go. Let's see if this does better. Rails DB migrate. Okay, so that's better. Let's have a look at this fact value. So now it belongs to customer and fact. When I glanced at that, I noticed that it only belonged to customer and got suspicious. Also, my migration blew up and that made me suspicious. So what we're going to do on customer is say has many fact values, and then has many facts through fact values. And then we will copy this, so save it and go over to fact, do the same thing, but in this case it's going to be has many customers through fact values. Now you don't necessarily have to always set up every has many belongs to relationship. I don't necessarily think you should unless you're going to use them all. But in this simple example, I don't really know exactly what I'm going to use just yet, so I'm going to just leave it. Okay, so let's look at what we can do here. So just to point one thing out, and this will make more sense after we look at a little bit more concrete example, but this fact model, if you wanted to keep this hard-coded so that you're not allowing users to create their own facts, for example, you could just, make this a regular Ruby class or something, and then keep some defaults in an array or something like that. So we kind of went an extra step here, and you'll see what I mean in a second. But let's go over here to our Rails console again, and let's create a few facts. So we'll say fact.new. And let's open up our schema really quick because I forgot what I just put in here. So we have facts, we have a name. So what do we have? Favorite, beetle. The data type on this is going to be, and data type you can define different ways depending on your application. So in this case, let's just say that we're going to keep it simple and it's either text or it's numbers. So it's textual or it's numeric. So textual, I don't know if we need to actually get that fancy. We can just say text. And the key, I want to be favorite. I lost my, favorite in the text wrapping. I mean, favorite beetle. And then we'll say fact equals underscore and then fact.save. Okay, so what is the fact? So, okay, basically we've just got one now. Let's do one more for the number of kids. So fact.new, and we'll say number of kids We'll put this as numeric or data type. Let's just keep it simple, right? Number. And over here we'll add a more readable name for number of kids. Okay, so now we have two facts that we could potentially use for one of our customers. So my mission right now is to actually get back to something approximating what we had earlier, where we could say something like customer.favorite beetle equals, right? Or customer.number of kids equals 4, or something like that. I want to kind of simulate that behavior and show you how this model essentially can function, essentially like having just attributes on your table. And there's different ways to go about doing this in different languages. Because it's Ruby, we're going to throw some metaprogramming magic at it and see what happens. So let's go over here to our customer, and I'm going to define method missing, and we'll say method name, and we'll take in args and block. Okay, and just to remind you, we're not going to build this out fully, so and this video is already over 20 minutes, I think, so I'm not going to keep going too long with this. But let's just start by puts method name here. And after that, you know what, let's do this. Let's say puts, I just want to get some clarity about what we're dealing with here. So we'll say puts method name, and then I want to do the same thing for arguments. And here we'll just puts and do splat args. That looks like it doesn't like having the splat there. Maybe I need it just like that. We'll see what happens. Let's run with it. Okay, so we'll just reload over here. Do we have any customers? Did I create some earlier? I believe I did. Customer equals underscore. Kind of bump this back up. So we'll say customer dot number of kids. And so we get method name, number of kids, and args is an empty array. Okay, let's say number of kids equals 4. And let's have a look at that. So here we're getting number of kids with the equal sign as the last line of the method, or the last character of the method, and an argument of 4. Okay, so the code we're going to write here is not going to be perfect, but I just want to remind us. Okay, so if we have some text, the last character is equals, so set that equal to text equals underscore. Man, that red is hard to read. So text, and then we can pass in the -1 and get that equal sign. Okay, so let's do this. If method name -1 equals, let's set fact value, else get fact value, and here let's pass in the method name and args, and I'm going to pass that in with a splat so that it continues to be an argument list. And over here we'll get fact value method name. So we're going to need to write those methods here, so I'm just going to make those private methods, and we'll say set fact value, and it's going to be method name args. And you know what I'm going to do here is actually come down here and just paste this for the moment, because we haven't actually done anything yet. So setting, and then I'm going to do the same thing for get fact value here, get fact value method name, and then I'm just going to copy this and say getting. So let's reload. And let's have a look again at customer. Let's do C equals underscore C dot number of kids. And so we're getting, and method name is number of kids, and it equals equals 4. Setting number of kids equals with the arguments 4. Okay, so now let's make this actually work. So I spent several minutes really perplexed with a bug that I kept running into, just to realize that I didn't actually create 2 facts. I thought I created 2, but there's only 1. So let me create another one. Fact.create. We'll do name, number of kids, and we'll do what is it? Key, number of kids, and then we'll do a data type, and what do we say? Number, like that, and then fact.last. Okay, cool. So now we should be able to get this to work. So back over in the code, what I want to do is basically say something like fact equals fact dot find by key, and that key is just a method name. And then we'll do fact value equals let's say fact value dot where, and we'll say fact ID is fact.id, and customer ID is customer, or that's actually self, right? So self.id dot first or create. And since that's wrapping like that, I'm just going to go ahead and split that onto some lines here. So what I want to report back is just fact value dot data, and let's just get this and see if this works. So let's run Rails C again and cycle up. I should have a customer equals something in here, customer, and then let's do customer, where was that? Customer number of kids. So you can look here and see that we have an insert into fact values, and then it just returns back nil. Now there's some really obvious glaring problems with this, like if we try to call like number of pets, it's going to tell us it doesn't find that because we don't actually have a fact called number of pets. So if you're using this in a real app, you have to take quite a bit of precaution. Like for example, there's a couple places here where this could be nil, and there's going to be even more. So you have to take some serious precautions around that, but I'm just going to kind of do some hand waving here and say you're going to have to figure that out, because we're just going to assume that you know what you're doing here. But with all of that said, let's just keep assuming that we know what we're doing and move forward. So let's go ahead and do the set fact value side of this. So we're going to need to do the same little not precautionary measure, just like we need to do the setup here. So we need to look up a fact, we need to look up the fact value, and then let's do fact value dot update, and we'll say data is args dot first, like that. And that's because it's an array and we're expecting there to be one value in there. And again, this is a fake app, it's not a real system, so we can kind of cut some corners here. So let's go ahead and reload this thing, and I'm going to clear the console. And I just realized that I made a small error here. So what we want to do is say key equals method name, and I guess we can do like 0 dot dot minus 1, and then right here we want to look up the key. So, and the reason for that is just over here really quick. Let's do our ASDF equals as a string, and let me make sure that I'm doing this right. Text 0 minus 1, and actually we could do minus 2 and get that. So again, we're making some pretty strong assumptions here about what's coming at us, and we're not handling any edge cases at all. So we're kind of really cutting corners here, but that is okay with me for the sake of keeping the video reasonably long. So, okay, let's go ahead and reload this again. And, excuse me. Let's come up here and say customer is customer.first. Customer.number of kids should still be nil. And let's set that equal to 4. And you see now we kick off an SQL transaction, and we can say customer.number of kids again. And we get 4. Now what you will notice is that this is basically a string now. And so if you wanted to do math, this becomes more difficult, because now anything that you look up from the database, you actually have to do some sort of conversion. In Ruby, it's fine. We can .2i over here. And we kind of, again, this is a thing where we cut a corner, because in some systems, like some that I've developed before, we've done something very similar to this, and you need to know more specifics, like is it a floating point number, is it an integer, so on and so forth. In this case, I don't think we really care, to be honest, because it's a simple example, and maybe in a CRM, you're talking about integers most of the time, or whatever reason, right? It doesn't matter. For our case, like, let's just assume the requirements were simple, so we kind of went with it's either a number or it's text. And let's open up our fact here really quick, and let's write a method for number, and let's say data type equals number. And then so down here we'll say fact.number, and we'll give that just kind of a ternary thing, and then otherwise we'll just say fact value dot data. Okay, so this should be the last little try here. So we'll reload. We'll do customer equals customer.first, customer.number of kids, and we get 4. Now we can also do things like customer.favorite Beetle equals John, and then we can look that back up after we save it here, and that's going to render out as text. So this is pretty cool. So what's really nice here is you could actually set this up where you, an administrator in the system, that is, or even the average user, could add their own interesting facts about customers that they want to track. And you don't have to touch the code anymore once it's all set up. I mean, in theory, right? But anyway, so that's kind of how the EAV works. And anyway, yeah, I think this is kind of a cool little overview here. So if we go back once again to our example, so you can see now this is the model that we're using, right? So our entity is the customer, the attribute is the fact, and then we have this fact values table, which is actually storing the real values. So the value points up to the attribute table, essentially, in order to know what it is, because there's no sense in this attribute table about what the value actually represents. So just having John can mean anything. It could be a first name, it could be a brand of some kind, or whatever. You need to know that it's pointing at the favorite Beetle attribute, or in our case, fact. So now this should make a little bit more sense. If we come back over here to the entity attribute value model, I told you I was going to stumble over that. Now we can think a little bit more about what this is saying. So it stores things in a space-efficient manner. What the heck is manner? Let's try that again. It stores things in a space-efficient manner, entities where the number of attributes that can be used to describe them is potentially vast, but the number that will actually apply to a given entity is relatively modest. Makes perfect sense now, right? So our customer could have an infinite number of interesting facts about them, but any individual customer will probably only have a few that we really care about storing. And so now you get this sense of a sparse matrix, right? So you have a big table with lots of null values in it. So basically what we've done is we've sort of changed it up so that we don't store null values. We only store values for things that we care about on any individual customer. So that's great. Now if we come back over here, now that we've worked through this, I think it'd be a good idea to read through this article, because there's definitely a trade-off. It is more difficult to get the data back out, and analysis is a little bit more challenging, because now you don't just have a number column in the database where you can run SQL against it. You have, in our case, a text column, and which could store numbers or text or whatever. Now, not all EAV systems are set up quite like that, but that is something that I've run into personally. So, and you could choose different architectural decisions and whatever, but the bigger problem is really like, even if you know exactly what type the data is, you don't necessarily know what it represents, right? Because they all point at different types of attributes. So gathering all the data and figuring out what it is and how to analyze it is a whole different aspect, and this article is about that. And then I have a lot of my own thoughts on it after doing this for years now. So in any case, it's challenging to get the data out. That's what they're saying here. So just keep that in mind. In any case, I think this is a pretty cool overview. I hope this was interesting for you. I think that's about it for this episode. As always, if you like this video, definitely give it a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel, because we're going to try to put out as much content like this as we possibly can. All of that said, I will talk to you in the next episode.